My work is easy because I use ClickUp. Here's how I keep track of all my tasks. I start by brain dumping everything I need to get done in a list view. Next, I set a priority and a due date to keep things on track. I create custom steps.
In August 1941, 3 lumbering Soviet bombers head towards Nazi-Allied territory. But these are no ordinary bombers, because for years the Soviets have been secretly developing a new kind of weapon: flying aircraft carriers, designed to pierce through enemy lines to deploy a swarm of fighter planes and dive bombers. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. And with the Soviet Union's darkest hour approaching, these massive juggernauts are about to make history, because they're headed straight for enemy territory. By the 1930s, it was clear that aircraft would play an essential role in future conflicts. But there was a problem that had plagued aircraft designers from the very beginning. Large, heavy bombers could carry lots of fuel, so they could fly great distances. But fighter aircraft, which had to be light and agile, could carry only enough fuel to cover a short distance. This mismatch had consequences. While bombers could fly deep into enemy territory, their fighter escorts couldn't. And over hostile airspace, the bombers were often on their own. With only a handful of machine guns to fend off enemy fighters, they were vulnerable and suffered heavy losses. But in 1930, Soviet engineer Vladimir Vakhmistrov came up with a radical solution.
Actually, it's pretty straightforward. If you could have the bombers carry the fighters, they could be transported over great distances and deployed whenever they were needed.
At first, Vakhmistrov's idea fell on deaf ears. The Red Army was focused on strength through numbers, not gambling on unproven ideas. But Vakhmistrov pressed on.
Comrades, flying aircraft carriers have tremendous potential. The fighters could not only protect the bombers, they could be fitted with their own bombs to make precise strikes against more challenging targets. Or they could be carried far out to sea to attack naval fleets which would otherwise be out of range. The fighters could even clear the path for our bombers by destroying enemy anti-aircraft guns in advance or by blinding them with smoke screens, making accurate targeting impossible. Flying aircraft carriers could also patrol our borders, remaining airborne, ready to intercept enemy bombers before they made it anywhere near their targets.
The strategic benefits couldn't be ignored, not even by the Red Army. The platform for Vakhmistrov's aircraft carriers would be the mighty TB-1 and TB-3. As the largest bombers of their time, they had plenty of power to carry the fighters. But figuring out where to attach them was the tricky part. In the wrong spot, the fighters would interfere with the bombers' control, or airflow would make launching them impossible. And in an era before sophisticated wind tunnels, it would all have to be figured out through trial and error. Vakhmistrov would call his creation Zveno, and he would end up flight testing more than a dozen configurations. In some models, the fighters were mounted above the wings, in others suspended below. One arrangement even saw 5 fighters carried at once. Remarkably, instead of weighing the bomber down, the fighters actually helped to boost their performance. Because during flight, the fighters would run their engines continuously, while drawing fuel from additional tanks fitted to the bomber. This brilliant setup allowed the bombers to fly faster, climb higher, and lift even more than they could have without the fighters attached. Launching the fighters was fairly straightforward. As long as the bomber was kept steady, any reasonably skilled pilot would manage. But reattaching to the carrier was another matter. On later versions, a trapeze-like system allowed pilots to dock with the carrier to take on more fuel. But docking was a skill that would take time to master. During flight, the fighters would communicate with the carrier using a telephone system, and a series of lights mounted in front of their gun sights would further signal commands.
Everyone was pleased with how Zvinov flew, but on the ground, things were more challenging. To load the fighters over the wings, we'd need all the help we could get, calling over mechanics, ground controllers, and anyone else unfortunate enough to be at the airfield. We all wondered if we could ever get used to such a strenuous task. And then everything changed for the better when we were provided with a tractor. Of course, this happened only thanks to the Soviet Communist Party and the wisdom of our great leader, Comrade Joseph Stalin.
But the flying aircraft carrier concept was viable, and Vakhmistrov had laid the groundwork for something truly remarkable. Vakhmistrov envisioned building enormous airborne motherships capable of carrying more than 20 fighters. He also wanted to develop purpose-built fighters that wouldn't need heavy landing gear and could be built with smaller wings for greater speed and maneuverability. Of course, these ideas would have to wait until the Zvenno carriers had proven useful to the Red Army. But after years of development, that turned out to be far more difficult than anticipated. Back in 1932, the Red Army seemed eager to accept the first version. But when new I-5 fighters became available, Vakhmistrov was ordered to modify his design. Then, when more powerful 4-engine TB3 bombers were introduced, Vakhmistrov was once again sent back to the drawing board. It was the same story when I-16 fighters became available. It wasn't until 1939, nearly a decade after the project started, that the Red Army finally accepted the carriers, with an order for 40 carriers equally divided amongst the Navy and Army. But by this point, some military planners were beginning to doubt the whole project. For one, the TB3 bomber was now obsolete. Next to a modern aircraft like the American B-17, the TB3 with its crude lines looked more like farm equipment. And there were doubts about whether the slow, lumbering bomber